So once again, I'd like to welcome Michele Maffei from Standard Bank. This is the final session in a series where he's been taking us through all of the many interesting facets of Africa, the volatility that occurs, but at the same time, how things work if you're prepared and how you can work there if you're prepared to look at things differently, which includes above all understanding liquidity, predicting the problems, and then gearing up your organization so that you can handle the opportunities, take advantage of the opportunities when they arise, and be prepared for and sit through the downtimes which will inevitably come. This session, which is the last one, and again, thank you for your time, Michele, and appreciate all the stuff which I found absolutely fascinating. What happens if you don't do all of these good things and you find yourself with a huge stack of trapped cash? You find yourself with foreign currency liabilities that are constantly increasing in local currency terms, or local currency assets that are going down in value. And you get all of these people coming to you with all of these wonderful schemes for how you can get money out of Nigeria by pretending you're an education, that you're in the education business, or there's all of these things about issuing bonds in the offshore market. Um, Assuming that you've got yourself in that position and that you have to listen to these people, what are the things that you can do, and how do you suggest people go about evaluating these propositions and the risks?
Okay, thank you, Damien, and thank you for inviting me to speak on the subject. Well, I think if you've done all your planning and you still find yourself caught behind in liquidity. I think one of the solutions is actually to make an application directly to the central bank on the basis of the particular business that you're involved in being systemically important for the country, and failure to reward the shareholders appropriately and to settle invoices threatens and undermines the underlying business as a major employer in the country. If the central bank doesn't enable you to get liquidity, then you will threaten them with leaving the country. That is one way. It's very seldomly works, but there have been examples where that kind of approach has resonated, and there has been some if you like, bilateral enablement of liquidity. The second thing that we're observing is parental support, but not in the form of just intercompany debt. Actually, we refer to it as the what I call the in and out trades. So a corporate naturally has a combination of import needs where it needs to buy foreign currency, but equally a lot of these corporates are actually investing in the country in the long term. And it is possible to structure in a way that inflows into the country can be ring fenced and then passed over to the local subsidiary for the settlement of invoices. So we refer to this as the in and out trade. And actually, if you look at volumes in Nigeria now, probably 3/4 of the daily traded volume on the INE market are represented by these kind of in and out flows, i.e., they're investment flows that are being used to service invoices that need to be settled. Another product that we have again observed, and it relies on the parent company support, is cross-currency swap trades, whereby the local subsidiaries basically buys and sells dollars, and clearly, because there is a sale of dollars in the future, the parent company has to provide a guarantee or a backstop that in the event that the dollars are not available in the future, then they will step in. That's frankly just kicking the can down the road, just deferring a problem that you have today. Nonetheless, we have observed this. The third area, which is actually accessing offshore market liquidity if available. So many of these markets actually, although have very limited liquidity, actually, and this is why in the first session that we did, Damien, I referred to convertibility, transferability, and liquidity, because many of these countries actually have convertible currencies, which means you can exchange and repatriate. The problem there is accessing liquidity, and often the liquidity in these countries comes from donor flows. And those donor flows can actually be quite meaningful so long as you are patient with it. And so we are observing that using the offshore liquidity in countries like Zambia, in countries like Malawi, in countries like Burundi, Rwanda, these are countries that actually receive donor inflows. And often it is possible by enabling the local subsidiary of a multinational to pay a foreign bank in the local currency to access these pools of offshore liquidity. And this is a tried and tested. In some markets, it is reasonably free. So, for example, you can do this in Kenya without any formal approval. If you try to do this in Malawi, then you need central bank approval for a resident to pay kwacha to a non-resident. But nonetheless, this is a structure that can be looked at. And then finally, there is the access to the parallel markets. And these parallel markets, I think it's probably good to call them parallel rather than black, because some of them are entirely legitimate. So, for example, there is the dual listed arbitrage. I don't know whether you're familiar with that, but that's basically buying in Nigeria the stock of Seplat that is listed in both London and Lagos. Then you have the stock delisted in London, in Lagos, and relisted in London, and then you sell it in London for pounds. That's an entirely legitimate transaction. It accesses a parallel rate, which is not the same as the INE rate, but it's entirely legitimate. Um, there are possibilities of actually using what we refer to as the transfer market, whereby two non-banking entities agree with their parent companies to exchange cash flows, onshore cash flows purely by a payment. One local subsidiary pays naira to another, and against that, the parent companies exchange dollars offshore at an agreed rate. Again, this is entirely legitimate. It's probably against the spirit of regulations in Nigeria, but actually it is a way that exporting companies are able to buy Nigerian naira at a rate substantially below, at a much cheaper rate than the INE market. And it's the way that importing companies are able to secure their dollars. And then you also have what we refer to as the fee market. So this is actually an onshore transaction where you have an exporter seeks a bank to arrange a transaction with an importer, and then the exporter and an importer on a bilateral basis exchange a facilitation fee with one another after the foreign exchange transaction has been concluded onshore. That is definitely not only against the spirit, but probably if the central bank were to find out, they would censure the entities involved. But almost all of these structures, with the exception of the dual listed arbitrage, tends to go against the spirit of regulations. And you do have the regulatory appetite of a corporate treasury will dictate how far down the line of these solutions people will entertain.
Okay, fascinating. So one problem that we come across regularly in our calls is that a lot of treasurers are not that familiar with all the nuts and bolts of what happens in these markets, and somebody comes along with this kind of proposal, and first sight it doesn't pass the smell test. It doesn't seem right. How would you recommend people go about trying to find out whether it's okay, or whether it's acceptable or not? And understanding that the answer is going to vary from country to country and also from company to company, depending on their risk appetite.
Absolutely, absolutely. So for example, the offshore solution in Malawi, the way to test whether it is going to work and it passes a smell test is actually to go to the central bank and ask them, say, would you mind very much if we do this? And the bank is very happy to entertain sponsoring that request to the central bank. And the answer there is ask the central bank in terms of would they approve it or would they not? That's the final backstop. Um, there are some structures as well. It's very important to decompose the structures into the components. And some structures will have an entirely offshore component, which is not the purvey of the local regulator. because it is being transacted between an offshore bank and the parent company of a multinational. It has nothing to do, right, with the underlying country in terms of the actual trades onshore. And then these structures will have an onshore leg. So the other thing is to look at is say, if you were to refer to the regulations, would the components of the transaction stand up as being legitimate? So any structure, for example, that results in a spot transaction onshore in Nigeria between a bank and a client at the INE rate actually passes the test of scrutiny. It's just a spot transaction. So long as the client has the documents for exchange control, then there is no problem in that transaction. If there is an offshore component to that, then, so long as there isn't contamination and the transactions are seen to be arm's length, then this should pass the smell test.
Okay, so if I understand correctly, I think this comes back to your comments in the previous section about trusted partner.
Absolutely. Yeah, and,
Okay.
and and the bank can help to understand those dimensions. The other thing actually, which I haven't said, which I do need to say, one of the other problems you often have is that the central bank, the regulators are not even handed in how they apply the regulations. And what they tend to do, they will tend often to favor local institutions against foreign-owned institutions, and therefore unfortunately the rules are not consistent. So they will shut an eye to a local institution doing things, whereas a foreign institution is under much greater scrutiny, and therefore less likely to be sailing closer to the wind.
You shock me. Okay, with that, Michele, I think we've come to the end of the time we have. Once again, I'd like to say thank you, not just for this session, but for the whole series. So again, I think just to go back, we've been through the need to understand liquidity, the need to understand where it comes from, then how you set up your operations, and you clearly think there's huge benefits to having an onshore presence, how you can use that onshore presence to position the company for liquidity crises. And then if you don't do all of that successfully, we've just been through some very helpful tips as to how you can manage the crisis once you've got it, recognizing it's best if you don't get there in the first place. So with that, Michele, again, I'd like to say thank you. It's been fascinating. We appreciate your time. And I'm sure you'll be very happy for our members to reach out to you if they've got questions.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Damien, for giving us the opportunity to talk about Africa. As I said at the outset, it is about demystifying Africa. Actually, it works differently, and there's plenty that can be done in order to manage the risks. You don't need to be incumbent, so long as you understand how to go about doing it.
And if I may, you need to be flexible and not necessarily trapped into a given way of thinking.
Yeah, exactly.
That I think is a key takeaway. So once again, many thanks. Appreciate your time.